I had a patient that came in just the other day, SIBO, but also H. pylori, crypto, and giardia. It's like, oh my, like those are some nasty infections. It's like, good luck. There's no amount of like, stress management or hydrochloric acid or sleep that will ever fix those infections. We need a serious boost to get rid of them. The approach that I created is a 5R approach. The first R is basically removing foods, pretty standard, removing all of the bad inflammatory foods. Now that could be your standard paleo. That could be going AIP, right? Cutting out nuts, seeds, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers. It could even be cutting out FODMAPs, which are fermentable carbohydrates, right? Fructo, oligodisaccharide, mono, and polyol. So depending on where our gut is at, how many symptoms we have, how sick we are, we may go to the extreme and go on a rotation diet, AIP, and low FODMAPs, which those are the hardest, but we may have to go to that extreme. So removing the bad foods, replacing the hydrochloric acid, the enzymes, the bile salts, and then repair. This is going to be being on an adrenal program at the same time. That's going to help provide the cortisol building blocks, because we need cortisol to build our gut lining up. If it's too high, we break it down, but if we're chronically fatigued and weak and sick, too low, we don't have enough to build it up. So I'm seeing a lot of patients that are actually in the low boat. So being on an adrenal program will be essential, so we have the cortisol building blocks to actually build our gut up. And then along with that, we'll give the extra healing nutrients, L-glutamine, licorice root, certain probiotics, certain nutrients to help build that gut lining up as well. Slippery elm, aloe, ginger, just nice anti-inflammatory herbs there to help provide a good foundation. And then the fourth R, that's where the second remove comes in. That's where removing the infections happens. Doesn't happen first, it happens fourth. And that's really the key difference in my kind of approach. It comes in last or second to last, and the very last thing is going to be probiotics. And again, depending on where we're at, we may even have to go soil-based. I always tell my patients, we throw down seeds after we weed. So the removing is where we throw down the seed, is where we weed, and then we throw down the seeds at the last R, which is reinoculation. You want to give space in the garden for the seeds to take foothold by weeding first. You don't go into a garden and throw a whole bunch of seeds down before you weed.
All right, welcome back, everyone. It's Mike Mutzel with HighIntensityHealth.com. I'm so grateful that you're with us today. We're with Dr. Gerstmar Marchegiani, and he's an expert when it comes to treating the gut. And I know we've had many interviews regarding the gut before, but you're going to hear a unique perspective because he's a very knowledgeable guy, and he does a lot of stool testing, a lot of organic acid testing. And so we're going to kind of give you some insights about some of those testing modalities and kind of what he's learned over the course of his 10-year-plus career being a chiropractic physician. So Dr. Marchegiani, thank you so much for being here.
Mike, it's so great to be here, and it was awesome to have you on my podcast just before, and it's like we're just kind of piggybacking right on top of the last hour. I love it.
Exactly. Hopefully we don't get confused and say, wait, we already talked about that, but we didn't.
I know, right? Totally.
That's funny. Okay, so let's kind of talk about your backstory. I've seen a lot of your videos, which are really good, by the way, but I didn't realize that you yourself had an autoimmune disease. So kind of share with us like what that journey's been like and kind of where you come from.
Yeah, great question. So I started off and I wanted to be a conventional medical doctor. I wanted to be a surgeon, ideally in orthopedics. And I worked in the surgery field for 4 years while I did my undergrad at UMass. And when I was in surgery, I would help hold the patients, and my main job was to hold the limbs on the diabetic patients as their limbs are being cut off because they were gangrenous, right? And hundreds of limbs passed through my possession on the way to the morgue, and it was quite interesting. And then after I would talk with the surgeon, and typically it'd be outside, he'd be smoking a cigarette, which is kind of contradictory because that's the same kind of damage that's creating these vascular issues that's causing the limbs to be cut off. So a lot of disconnect there. And my main focus was, how can we get in front of this thing, right? These people are all, behind it. They're doing the end stage stuff. How can we get in front of it? And that's where functional medicine really became, the forefront for me, studying great doctors like Dr. Dan Kalish and other functional medicine pioneers to really get my foundation. And part of that foundation emanates in the gut and the adrenals and hormones and blood sugar. And we'll kind of go deeper into that today. But that's where my foundation came from. And in that in the travel there, I had, autoimmune thyroid condition. I had chronic fatigue, adrenal fatigue, brain fog. And I'm just like, what do I have to do? I'm sleeping 12 hours a night, having 6 cups of coffee a day, can't focus, can't think. My brain's is just like, it's stupid. I can't retain anything. What do I have to do to get back? And then it was just, let's just find people who are really good helping people, and let's just copy and do what they're doing, and then just re-examine the results. Mm-hmm. Results always speak for themselves.
Yeah, fantastic story. Now, so Hashimoto's, I don't think that's very prevalent in men. Have you looked? I don't know that I've ever met another man with Hashimoto's. So do you have other autoimmune diseases? Like, talk about kind of the prevalence of Hashimoto's in men versus women.
Yeah, so in women, you're going to see about 20% of all women are going to have, for the most part, Hashimoto's. About 1 in 5 in general. It's about 30 million people in the United States with autoimmune conditions or with hypothyroidism. Again, some of the studies show 50 to 90% are going to be autoimmune in nature. It's tough. We'll run panels. We'll run TPO, thyroid peroxidase, antithyroid binding globulin, and sometimes it won't come up. We won't catch it. About half the time I catch it. So when they say 90%, I'm always a little bit like, all right, that just sounds a little too extreme, because I run these tests every day, dozens of times a week. But it's possible to get a false negative. You may palpate and feel a little bit of, a nodule or a little bit of inflammation, or you may even have to refer out for an ultrasound. But that's going to be your better marker is ultrasound or even a biopsy. But I never go to that extreme. I just look, if I see an autoimmune condition, that's great. But I always treat as if there's an autoimmune condition. We're always cutting out the foods. We're always making sure the extra nutrients like selenium that can help abate the autoimmunity is present. We're always making sure any infections that could drive autoimmunity, Epstein-Barr, Yersinia enterocolitica, H. pylori, these are going to be the big infections that are going to drive autoimmunity. We're making sure we eradicate those as well.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Let's dive into those pathogens. But first, you hit on selenium, and I'm so glad you did, because when we think of the thyroid, a lot of folks think of just iodine, and they kind of neglect selenium and so forth. And selenium is so key. I'll let you tell the story, but a really cool antioxidant in the thyroid gland. So talk to us why selenium is important.
Well, selenium is really important. It's a precursor for glutathione, but in the process, our thyroid produces thyroid hormone via iodination. That's basically binding iodine to molecules of tyrosine. All right. So essentially we have tyrosine and we have 4 molecules of iodine attached to it. And when that process happens, one of the byproducts of iodination is hydrogen peroxide, H2O2. And in the process of selenium, or in the presence of selenium, that actually helps come in there and it neutralizes the hydrogen peroxide to water and oxygen. Makes it very benign. But a lot of people are selenium deficient, so we get this extra hydrogen peroxide, which then stimulates our B lymphocytes. This is part of our Th2 or humoral immune system to come in there and start attacking. And when that whole process happens, thyroid hormone can spill out. You can feel hyper, but you're really hypo. And it's just this whole entire destruction that's happening. And the first thing I see anytime we have an autoimmune thyroid patient come in, we're really working on the adrenals, inflammation, diet, and selenium. 200 micrograms of selenium over 6 months will knock down the thyroid's 50%. Antibodies.
Yeah, that's such a big story. And so I recommend, and I would love to hear your opinion, anyone that's taking iodine should definitely take selenium along with that, because when you're taking iodine, as you just described, that organification of the tyrosine, meaning you're adding on the iodine residues and so forth, you're creating a lot of free radical stress. So if you're supplementing with iodine and not using selenium at the same time, you can be causing more harm than good. And I think that's why we see a lot of people that supplement with iodine unopposed with selenium, they have issues with iodine.
Absolutely. And then the big form of selenium is going to be selenomethionine. Don't get stuck in there saying, well, I'm going to use Brazil nuts. Again, Brazil nuts, there's a 10-to-1 ratio, or it's about a 10 times the differentiation between what's in Brazil nut, one day versus the other. Meaning you could have 100 micrograms one day and then 10 the next. So you don't quite get a steady dose. So I recommend going with a steady selenium source that you're going to get 200 to 400 mics is a really good starting point.
So what I heard you say is the form of selenium is selenomethionine. That's what we want. But Brazil nuts, the form of selenium in Brazil nuts kind of varies, and we don't really know what it is all the time.
Well, the selenium in Brazil nuts, I'm not sure the exact molecule of it. It's the amount that varies. So we could have 100. We could have, 100, I think they say 3 Brazil nuts to equal 200 micrograms, but it can be off by a factor of 10. It could be 10 one day or 100 one day. So you just don't quite know how you're dosing it. And selenium, once you start getting over a gram, it starts becoming toxic. So don't go with Brazil nuts. Spend, an extra 30 cents on a selenium supplement per day.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So it's kind of like resveratrol and red wine. We don't really know the growing conditions of the grapes. Right. Okay, cool.
Exactly.
All right, so let's kind of circle back to the pathogens. You talked about Yersinia, H. pylori. Maybe let's talk about the pathogens north to south. You have some great videos on H. pylori, which, as I understand, H. pylori is really more of a pathogen in the stomach. Is that right?
Yeah, it's going to be in the stomach, and you'll also see it in the first parts of the small intestine. And again, H. pylori is one of these critters that can spread really easily. I had a female patient, who their husband and child had issues as well. And we're like, I guarantee you, your husband and your kid have H. pylori. She said, okay, let's run the test. We ran them, both came back positive. And I see that quite frequently because this infection can be spread very easily via saliva. So, non-sexual touching can easily spread this type of pathogen around.
Wow. Okay. So in addition to affecting stomach acid production, we know that H. pylori does some other things. Do you want to kind of talk about that? Like H. pylori is one of these, it contains endotoxin, which we've talked a lot about on the show, Dr. Justin. And for those, just as a quick review, endotoxin is that bacterial appendage that's really pro-inflammatory. So is that kind of why H. pylori is bad, or is it that it affects stomach acid? Like, why don't we want it there?
Well, the first thing that H. pylori does, you've already said it, it produces this enzyme called urease. So when we consume protein, one of the byproducts of protein digestion is urea, and that urease enzyme will basically hit that urea, and then off of that comes ammonia and CO2. So one of the things they test in an H. pylori breath test is excessive CO2, which we'll see with H. pylori is present. But the one thing that we're not touching upon is the ammonia. It's got a pH of 11. So again, our gut's typically a 1.5 to 2 or so pH. So if we throw in a pH of 11 in there, that can significantly increase the pH. And again, our stomach, right? Healthy parasympathetic tone, right? Being, the chewing and all that stuff we talked about, getting the vagus nerve activated, that's going to lower our hydrochloric acid levels, it's going to lower our pH by raising our hydrochloric acid levels, which activates all of the protein digesting enzymes in our stomach. So that's the first domino for digestion. And that healthy acidity in our stomach then stimulates cholecystokinin and pancreatic lipase and protease in the small intestine. So that first domino of the H. pylori really messing up the pH really, sets our digestion off. And there's lots of studies showing that H. pylori can drive hypochlorhydria, which we already know, which then creates a lot of these mineral malabsorptions, zinc, selenium, there's your thyroid issue, magnesium, which these are all important for thyroid conversion, T4 to T3. So we can have a whole host of issues from that.
That's a big deal. And then also, does this tie into like acid-base balance inside the body? So we know that when we eat like processed carbohydrates, we become more acidic. When we eat hard cheeses and not enough vegetables. So can this bug actually cause us to be more acidic?
Well, that's a really good question. When it comes to acidity in the blood, right, we have a pretty tight regulation right around 7.3, 7.35. Give or take 0.1. So our regulation of pH in our blood is very, very, very strict. It needs to be that way because a lot of our enzymes in our body are pH driven. But what I really see happening is inflammation. Right? I see inflammation, I see malabsorption, and it's very possible because if we have a lot of these healthy minerals which may be alkaline in nature, and if we can't absorb them, break them down, utilize and assimilate them, that could potentially affect our pH. Probably not going to affect our blood because our blood buffers from other areas, but it's definitely going to put stress on our body for sure.
That's really good information. Now, you also had highlighted a study in one of your videos where you talked about individuals that were taking thyroid medication, and they also took proton pump inhibitors or acid suppressing medication. Do you want to talk about the connection between stomach acid and medications?
Yeah, so in that study, they were talking about patients that had hypothyroidism, and they were talking about ones that were taking proton pump inhibitors, and their need for thyroid hormone was greater, meaning their TSH went up, meaning they had to give more thyroid hormone to lower that TSH. So the key take home from that is that we're not fixing the malabsorption when we give a Nexium or a Prilosec or an Omeprazole. We're just covering up the symptoms of indigestion, bloating, gas, belching, flatulence. We're covering it up with the medication, but we're not fixing the underlying problem. And that's the huge issue, because low stomach acid equals low enzyme activity, which equals low absorption, and will more than likely even drive leaky gut, because the lipopolysaccharide, that toxin, that outer layer of the bacteria, is, according to Alessio Fasano, the second strongest stimulator for zonulin and for leaky gut.
That's amazing. And as we talked about earlier with leptin and insulin resistance, this lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin drives insulin and leptin resistance. So not only is it causing leaky gut, but it's affecting leptin and insulin signaling and all these bad things. So no good. Now, along those lines, so let's talk about, you talked about assessment with the breath test. Is that kind of, I know there's like the stool antigen, breath test, like what's the most accurate?
So that really depends. Anytime I have a patient presenting with these symptoms, we're going to test all the possible ways. So we have our basic like H. pylori stool culture kind of test, right? Your stool antigen test, if you will. That's where we're looking for an actual piece of the H. pylori in a stool. We have the blood test, which is, we're going to be looking at IgA, IgG, IgM. Okay. IgA and IgM are going to be more, it's like your acute immune response. That means your immune system's been active recently because this infection is relatively new. Where IgG is more of a longer term response, but this is indirect, right? Next, after that, we have the breath, where we're looking at elevations in CO2 in response to drinking some fluid, because the H. pylori and the urease with the elevations of CO2. And then we also even have a DNA test, a PCR test, where we can look at DNA pieces, of the H. pylori via the stool, which is really cool as well.
And I gather, or I inferred from what you just said, that the PCR is what you like to use, because you also like to use that to look at other bugs. Is that where we're going?
Yeah, the PCR is good, but I mean, here's the thing. When you get in the trenches and you're working with people, you have like an idea of what sounds really cool and what feels good, but then you try it and you get 30 patients up and you run tests side by side. What sounds good and what actually works in reality doesn't quite jive. So my opinion, the BioHealth, the 401H, their H. pylori portion of that stool test tends to be the best one for picking up H. pylori, bar none. But again, every now and then I'll see a breath test and or a blood that will pick something up where the stool didn't.
Interesting. Yeah, I know one of the first conference calls I've ever done in my life was back in 2008, and I had Dan Kalish on, and he was talking about the BioHealth diagnostics. I know he's been a big fan of their test. So for H. pylori specifically and all bugs, like Yersinia and all the gut bugs we're going to talk about, is that the best test or just for H. pylori?
That's going to be the best test for H. pylori and all major bugs. I typically find Yersinia picked up better in the blood. I'll use a test called Medical Diagnostic Laboratories. They run a really great infection panel. I'll use that to run that. Anyone that's chronically ill, we'll run the BioHealth, and we'll either combine that with the DNA from DRG Laboratories. They are the ones that actually created the technology for Metametrics Genova, but they pulled it last year, which I'm like pulling my hair out. Why are you pulling out this great technology? Right. They pulled it out, and they redid it in this new lab called DRG, but the technology isn't quite as good as it used to be with Metametrics. So we'll use 1 to 3. I have about 4 or 5 different stool companies that I will kind of pick and choose from depending on the patient's issues.
Yeah. Interesting. So I can see it gets pretty complex quick, you have to use your clinical judgment and kind of what's worked with past patients to kind of piece these things together. That can be kind of challenging.
Yeah. I mean, I run these tests dozens of times a week. So when you get the actual data, it's like you're running your own little clinical trial, I got into this field by being around doctors that were already successful. And then I kind of followed suit, and then I just started then going out and testing my own things. And I'm like, you really want to look and see what's coming back up clinically, and then using that. Clinical research always trumps, the academic stuff, because it's here and now, it's instantaneous. You don't have this 10 or 20 year lag time of it getting back into the textbooks.
Yeah, which is unfortunate. So let's kind of talk about like PCR versus culture. I know there's a big debate on that right now. So from what I gathered, you're looking more at culture. Is that kind of in blood combination?
Yeah, I mean, I will do the BioHealth tends to be the best for the H. pylori, and they've really tweaked out their technology where they're doing some new shipping technology where they're freezing it better and preserving it better, that it's coming back twice as positive. Twice more frequency in the positive findings for H. pylori.
I guess let's finish off on H. pylori now with treatment, and then move into more SIBO and stuff like that. So I know mastic gum, there's a couple of herbs and stuff. What have you found to be most effective for H. pylori?
Well, mastic gum is going to be great. Okay. Also, berberines. Berberines are like a family of specific herbs. This could be golden seal. It could be barberry. It could be Chinese coptis. It could be Oregon grape. These are very, very good. The nice thing I like about berberines is they block the efflux pumps. So efflux pumps are these this mechanism that the bacteria have. Here's the analogy I use. It's a little confusing, but here's the analogy. Imagine you're in a canoe, a hole in the canoe occurs, and you're bailing out water, right? Mm-hmm. So water from the outside is coming into your canoe, and then you're bailing it out. So imagine you and the canoe are like the bacteria you're trying to kill. You're the H. pylori, all right? And the water coming in is like the antibiotic, or it's like the antimicrobial herb. So the efflux pumps are basically trying to bail out that antibiotic or that antimicrobial back into the water. That's what it's doing. And when we use these specific herbs, especially the berberine family, I like golden seal, it knocks out, it basically takes that bucket out of your hand, so then the canoe takes on water faster and sinks. So the goal is we want the infection to take on the antimicrobial medicines faster, not bail it back out into the gastrointestinal tract, creating more side effects and antibiotic resistance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm confused here on the canoe. Are we talking about on the bacteria, the microbes themselves, we're affecting these efflux pumps so that they just die and they don't spew the toxins? Is that what I heard?
Yeah. So basically, imagine we want to bathe that bacteria in the antimicrobial, and if it's bailing it back out into the water, that's not good. So we want that canoe to be able to take on. We want that bacteria to be able to take on more of that antimicrobial medicine or antibiotic faster, so then we can kill it.
Awesome.
Does that help?
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So berberine is really hot right now for diabetes as well. And like we talked about in the podcast that we'll mention later, your own podcast, we talked about the gut hormones and how the GI tract releases all these incretin compounds. And we know that berberine.
But chew your food 43 times, right?
Exactly. That's right.
You have to listen to the podcast to be able to get that inside joke. So watch it.
We'll put the link below this video. So back to berberine. That's berberine hydrochloride has been shown to be very effective for diabetes. And you mentioned berberines as being so have you looked at that or found individuals taking these berberines? Does their blood sugar improve, or are the mechanisms different? Any insights?
Well, there's a lot of studies on that. I'm not charting that specifically. Again, I will use berberines with some of my diabetic patients. And again, I think the mechanism could be potentially inflammatory. I really wonder what's happening. We know that when SIBO patients get treated, there's better insulin sensitivity when their SIBO is addressed. So I think part of this is inflammatory and infection-based.
Yeah.
It's very possible. I don't see the berberine like, I could be wrong, I don't see it maybe having the same mechanism as cinnamon or gymnema or as chromium or alpha-lipoic acid. I see it having more an infection role.
Yeah. Yeah, so affecting the microbes, which in turn affect maybe the inflammatory response, which of course affects the metabolic response, something along those lines.
Leptin, insulin sensitivity, the whole 9 yards. Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome information. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So you mentioned SIBO. We've talked about SIBO a little bit, but why don't you give us an overview of what SIBO is, and then how often are you finding this in your patients?
Well, now this is really interesting because Dr. Dan Kalish and I had a conversation about this recently, and he had talked to Allison Seebecker, and Allison Seebecker had told him personally, so this is kind of a secondhand conversation, hey, Dr. Kalish, don't be sending me all these patients for SIBO that still have all these other infections like Giardia and Blasto and H. pylori. Get rid of the infections first. And one of the things that I find, and this isn't all the time, every now and then you get a patient that's really tough, but the majority of the time, if you address the infection, the SIBO and everything else tends to take care of itself. Because a lot of the herbs that you're using to knock out the infection are going to be sensitive to the SIBO as well. So we always want to make sure, hey, Blasto, Giardia, Crypto, any of these other infections, Dientamoeba, Fragilis, Ehisto, we want to make sure we address them before we go deeper, because a lot of times you may not have to.
I personally had high levels of Blastocystis hominis back in 2008 and then treated that with metronidazole or Flagyl, and that totally was a train wreck for my gut. But anyway, I think it helped. I didn't retest. I didn't have any other GI issues. But will those sort of pathogens, parasite-based pathogens and so on, will those show up in this biohealth diagnostic test you recommended earlier?
Yeah, I mean, it will show up most of the time. I say that because I always tell patients there's a good 10 to 15% of the chance that it may not show up, just because these infections may not always be shedding. So anytime I have patients with, a digestive symptom in the top 2 or 3, we'll run 2 different tests at 2 different times. So then we have a better chance of picking up what the bug is. It's really important.
Yeah, so that's great information. So if we want to kind of dive a little bit deeper and talk about the mechanisms here, so if you have one of these other pathogens that's affecting the gut ecology, then you will present with SIBO-like symptoms, and it doesn't make sense to just first address the SIBO. You have to address kind of these pathogens first, and in most cases, that will clear out the SIBO.
Yeah, in most cases it will. So we're talking about SIBO, we're talking about basically a bacterial overgrowth from the colon into the small intestine. So when we're assessing infections in the upper gut, right, in the small intestine or even in the stomach, a stool test can be very helpful, right? Also, even an H. pylori breath test can be helpful too. When we're looking down deeper in the colon, it's helpful to do a SIBO breath test where we're basically giving, I think the exact mechanism is 10 grams of lactulose. And lactulose is this very large sugar that essentially can't be digested by our body, but certain bacteria, especially the bad ones, can. So we drink this solution of lactulose. It takes about 2 hours or about 120 minutes to get down into the lower part of the small intestine, which is the ileum. So essentially we'll start seeing a rise in hydrogen or methane right around that time. And I think it's greater than 15 on the hydrogen and 3 on the methane. Again, typically I always have a lab test in front of me telling me the ranges. So 15 on the hydrogen and 3 on the methane. Greater than those is usually a positive marker for SIBO.
Okay. Do you do the SIBO testing first, or do you do the pathogen testing first?
You know, it really depends. Patients with chronic issues will typically do the gut testing first, and if they have bugs, I don't even waste my time on the SIBO testing. It's just not worth it because we're going to knock out the bugs, we'll retest, we'll see how they're doing. If the bugs are gone and they're feeling better, probably not the best use of our resources. If the bugs are gone and they're not feeling better, that's when I pull out the SIBO testing. Because then it gives us justification to go deeper and longer, and the patient has kind of a map and a bullseye of what's happening.
Yeah, that's really great. And so this is why it's important to work with a practitioner on these issues, because if you were using whole food, and while we can all sit here and talk about how the benefits of whole food and why to eat real whole food and so forth, if you don't clear the bugs, you can get off the onions and garlic and some of these high FODMAP foods, and still have the pathogens and have issues.
Yeah, and I had a patient that came in just the other day. SIBO, but also H. pylori, crypto, and giardia. It's like, oh my God, like those are some nasty infections. It's like, good luck. There's no amount of stress management or hydrochloric acid or sleep that will ever fix those infections. We need a serious boost to get rid of them.
Well, let's talk about what you did. I mean, so was this just the berberine compounds, or were there other herbs? Like, share with us kind of like your kill protocol.
Yeah, so my mentor in kind of getting the whole protocol, Dr. Kalish is really great. Dr. Timmons, he created BioHealth Labs. He's been really profound. One of the things that he has as a foundation of his herbal killing is wormwood or Artemisia. All right, Artemisia is very, very powerful. It's been used for tens of thousands of years. Again, for anyone listening, be careful with using artemisinine. There's been a lot of resistance or bacterial resistance with artemisinine. Using the whole herb Artemisia, totally different. There's antioxidant properties in it that make it a little bit different. So Artemisia is a better place to start. Again, you got to be careful because there's a progression that I use in practice when treating infections. And sometimes the most important thing may be the infection, but we have to wait a few months to get there. So the approach that I created is a 5-hour approach. The first hour is basically removing foods, pretty standard, removing all of the bad inflammatory foods. Now that could be your standard paleo. That could be going AIP, right? Cutting out nuts, seeds, tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers. It could even be cutting out FODMAPs, which are fermentable carbohydrates, right? Fructooligodisaccharide, mono, and polyol. So depending on where our gut is at, how many symptoms we have, how sick we are, we may go to the extreme and go on a rotation diet, AIP, and low FODMAPs, which those are the hardest, but we may have to go to that extreme. So removing the bad foods, replacing the hydrochloric acid, the enzymes, the bile salts, and then repair. This is going to be being on an adrenal program at the same time. That's going to help provide the cortisol building blocks, because we need cortisol to build our gut lining up. If it's too high, we break it down, but if we're chronically fatigued and weak and sick, too low, we don't have enough to build it up. So I'm seeing a lot of patients that are actually in the low boat. So being on an adrenal program will be essential, so we have the cortisol building blocks to actually build our gut up. And then along with that, we'll give the extra healing nutrients, L-glutamine, licorice root, certain probiotics, certain nutrients to help build that gut lining up as well. Slippery elm, aloe, ginger, just nice anti-inflammatory herbs there to help provide a good foundation. And then the fourth R, that's where the second remove comes in. That's where removing the infections happens. Doesn't happen first, it happens fourth. And that's really the key difference in my kind of approach. It comes in last or second to last, and the very last thing is going to be probiotics. And again, depending on where we're at, we may even have to go soil-based. I always tell my patients, we throw down seeds after we weed. So the removing is where we throw down the seed, is where we weed, and then we throw down the seeds at the last R, which is reinoculation. You want to give space in the garden for the seeds to take foothold by weeding first. You don't go into a garden and throw a whole bunch of seeds down before you weed.
We throw down seeds after we weed. That's really great info, because I think if we look at your hand, most people are starting here at the pinky, where they're taking probiotics or giving some antimicrobial herbs, and then they might do some diet things and so forth. But that connection between the adrenals and cortisol and gut repair, I haven't really heard before, but I know that's something that Kailash and so forth have been doing for quite some time. So thanks for explaining that. That's really a great place to start. So at first, as we want to just kind of reinforce, you started out with food, and it sounded a little complex. Autoimmune, paleo, and then so what are folks, if they're really complex and having an issue with the diet, and you mentioned they're autoimmune paleo and no seeds, no nuts, no potatoes, and so forth, what are they eating?
So really simple. I know I have a nice list that I give all my patients. Basically any kind of healthy meat, any kind of pasture-fed organic meat. This could be chicken, fish, turkey, beef, again, shellfish, any type of fish. For the most part, we'd cut out eggs for the first month. So any kind of meat. And then regarding vegetables, we would, depending on how sick we are, we may go low FODMAP, we may not. So we have a list of our vegetables. I have a low FODMAP vegetable list that I give them, and we just talk about which ones work. And then we go over the fats, which you can do ghee, you can do tallow, beef, olive oil, MCT, coconut. Those are some good starting ones right there.
Great. That's awesome.
So it depends. The sicker people are and the more chronic, the more extreme. Like I had a patient the other day where we had to do a rotation element to it because they were just allergic to everything. So that's where it's like, you can do all the food allergy testing in the world, but if you got a serious leaky gut with multiple infections, anything you eat consistently, you'll develop a food allergen. Don't waste your money on food allergy testing because you already know if you eat it more than a couple days in a row, your immune system will be attacking it and responding.
Fantastic. So let's kind of talk about yeast. This is something that I think you do a lot of organic acid testing, and yeast show up there. So we've talked about bugs and parasites and bacteria and so forth. Tell us kind of what you're seeing on the clinical side with yeast.
Oh, so yeast is one of those, it's tougher to really pick it up in stool testing. Sometimes we do. BioHealth does not do a good job picking it up. But one of the things that, I will look at is clinical signs, right? What's your history of jock itch, athlete's foot, dandruff? Do you have any kind of blotchy red marks that maybe get a little itchy from time to time? What's your history with yeast infections? Also, history of antibiotic use. Antibiotic use is commonly notorious for rebound yeast or fungal overgrowths. So that's really important to start. Now, a lot of the herbs we use to treat the infections, again, will be sensitive to the yeast, but sometimes we have to come in afterwards and really just focus on the yeast after the fact. So the stool testing, we may see it. We may see it in the GI effects test, and we'll also see it in the BioHealth test. There's a marker called D-arabinitol, which is an organic acid that's indicative for high levels of yeast.
Great. So that's why you like the organic acids, in addition to all the adrenals, and we can look at metabolic metabolites in the Krebs cycle. Is you pick up yeast better?
Yeah, you can pick up yeast there really well. If we miss it in the stool test, we can definitely pick it up there. But again, good clinical signs are going to be so helpful.
That's great info there. What else on the organic acid? So we've kind of talked a lot about the gut, but since we're here, I think a lot of folks aren't really aware of organic acids and kind of what it does and what it looks at and so forth. Like, what do you find to be most beneficial, and who would benefit from possibly getting an organic acid test?
Well, while you do that, let me actually pull up my organic acid test that I did just a couple months ago. Again, I do an organic acid test every 6 months.
Oh, wow.
Just to keep my body in tune. So with organic acids, you can also get a window into nutrient deficiencies, kind of like a SpectraCell or maybe a NutriEval. That's helpful. But again, what's better about the organic acid test, in my opinion, is you get windows into how certain body systems are doing. I mean, we can look at fatty acid metabolism, carbohydrate, energy production, B complex, methylation, which is important. Like a lot of people will say, well, you need certain kinds of B12, and then the organic test will say, well, you need adenylyl B12, and sometimes we'll be able to see that on an organic acid test.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the neurotransmitter metabolism markers are great. Again, they're indirect. This could be vanamandylate, 5-hydroxyindoloacetate. It could be homovanillate. But these are markers for serotonin or dopamine. And this can be really indicative of, do we need to give you some extra amino acid brain support, which can be super helpful. And on my test, I actually, was showing to be very low in the sulfur amino acid. So I added in the L-methionine, like we chatted about last call.
Yeah.
And I've also added in some of the brain aminos, the 5-HTP and the L-tyrosine at higher levels, and my brain's been much better the last few months with this new tweak in my protocol personally.
Interesting. When you say better, we're talking focus, sleep, cognition, like
everything. Focus, speech, being able to multitask, just overall feeling subtle. But I mean, when you're at a higher level, just a little bit, you get extra. You can really feel it. It's nice. It's a good feeling. And it's like I'm kind of like, man, I want to retest and see where I'm at and see if I can get even better after that.
Keep tweaking it.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
Cool. So anything that you wanted to talk about, when it comes to the gut, organic acids and digestion and so forth, that we didn't really get to address, Dr. Justin?
I think one thing to keep in mind is that inflammation in the gut is bidirectional. So if we're inflamed systemically, let's say we have an Epstein-Barr infection or we're just stressed because of emotions or stressed because of sleep, right? Inflammation externally outside of the gut can create inflammation in the gut. And then inflammation in the gut with the various inflammatory byproducts, biotoxins. You mentioned LPS or endotoxin. SIBO also produces lithocholic acid. All of these things can go outside of our gut and affect our mood, right? Go Google endotoxin or LPS and depression, right? So a lot of the things that happen in our gut can go outside of our gut and affect us mood-wise, and even can create inflammation systemically too. Right? And people know that certain infections can create inflammation in the joints, like mycoplasma, or even maybe eating potatoes and nightshades can cause joint issues too. So inflammation food-wise can create systemic problems, and inflammation in the gut with the biotoxins can create problems outside of the gut. So it's kind of this two-lane highway of inflammation in, inflammation out.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's a great point, which reminds me I wanted to ask you about testing for some of these inflammatory things like Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus and so forth. So maybe people have, a healthy gut, so to speak, like no overt pathogens, but they have these systemic pathogens and so on. So where does that come into the clinical picture?
So we're talking about viruses now? Is that the direction we're going into?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to talk about, like you mentioned, these systemic inflammatory, microbes, whether it's virus, bacterial, or so forth.
Yeah. So some of the ones that may be more systemic would be, I would just go with some of the Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, or maybe even like the Lyme's type of co-infections, which could be like your Mycoplasma, Babesia, or Bartonella. So there's some good, really comprehensive tests out there that can assess some of these. IGeneX has a really good test. They're in Palo Alto. They have a really good test for some of the Lyme's co-infections. Mm-hmm. I use a test called Medical Diagnostic Laboratories. They have a really good test for cytomegalovirus and Epstein-Barr, so you can assess whether it's reactivated. A lot of people will come back really high when they run Epstein-Barr, but again, you have to look at the right markers. You need to make sure it's either IgM or early antigen IgG. I know that's really kind of like maybe a little bit too high level there because it's like very clinical based, but early antigen IgG or anything IgM is a sign of a reactivation when it comes to Epstein-Barr.
Mm-hmm. Now, would normal humans, have these viruses and so forth, or viral titers, or are these things that you would only have if you had, levels that are in the unhealthy range?
Well, a lot of people are going to have high levels of these Epstein-Barr titers. We'll see the nuclear antigen high or the viral capsid antigen high. It's just when we see it either IgM or we see it early antigen, that's usually a sign of the reactivation where our immune system is on it and is now like stressing itself out to attack it, and that's where addressing the reactivation can be helpful. Take stress off the body, and we know Epstein-Barr is linked with chronic fatigue. Mm-hmm. You can just go Google EBV and chronic fatigue, and there's definitely a connection.
Yeah, that's amazing. So anything that you found to be clinically the most effective for treating these different viral titers?
Well, again, you always have to have like the foundation in place, right? You have to have the diet, you have to have the lifestyle, blood sugar stability, sleep, cutting out all the inflammatory foods. I think a lot of functional medicine doctors may miss those things. They may just make the assumption that they're there, and then start to create all these antiviral protocols that could be very helpful, but may not address the underlying issue.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of different herbs that can be used, though. Propolis, silver can be used, reishi, cat's claw, olive leaf, monolaurin. Lots of different nutrients can be used. Again, it really depends on the patient, kind of where they're at. You have to take in the whole clinical picture really to create a comprehensive program, because there's so many different things you could do where you kind of get overwhelmed. Well, what's the best?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, great information, and you're just dropping truth bomb after truth bomb. So I want to make sure that our folks, if they're driving or listening to this while they're at the gym and they're trying to take notes, we take notes for you, and that will be posted at highintensityhealth.com/Dr. Justin. So be sure to check that out, because all the labs and references and so forth that you mentioned, which is now getting quite extensive, I want to make sure that we summarize that there for folks, so if they want to learn more about that. So
and if you want to dig a little more too, Mike, Dr. Nicholas Hedberg has a great course called The Infection Connection at infectionconnection.net, which kind of goes into some of these things deep too. That's a very helpful reference.
Yeah, that's interesting. So my Epstein-Barr was really high at one point, and I was suffering from fatigue. It wasn't debilitating or categorized as chronic fatigue, but I was just getting really tired, and so I was doing high-dose vitamin C IVs, and that really, it was 3 or 4 of them, and then I noticed a huge difference. I haven't retested, but I feel a lot better, and so I had the diet stuff kind of figured out. But any comments there on IV nutrition that you found to be effective?
Yeah, actually, that's funny. I just interviewed Dr. Laura Noel on my show, and one of the topics we addressed was IV nutrition. And yeah, we talked about Myers cocktail, intravenous vitamin C. She recommends when you're more stressed to do more of the whole magnesium in there. So Lauren's a great reference and a great resource for that. So I would have to leave that question to her, because she's doing more of it. But I think the high-dose vitamin C would be really a really good start. And I don't do it, but I know that it does work well. You could do ozone as well. IV ozone would be very helpful too.
Yeah, I've heard of that as well. Awesome. Well, this has been just fantastic. You have so much information here, Dr. Justin, just a wealth of information. So there's 2 questions that we ask every guest on the show. And the first question would be, if there's just one herb, botanical, or nutrient that, let's say you're going on a vacation and you just can only pack one thing, what would that nutrient, herb, or botanical be, and why?
All right. I think my favorite herb that I use for adrenal support is going to be eleuthero. Eleuthero is my favorite herb. It helps boost immune function, but also increases DHEA, which is a precursor to a lot of your anabolic hormones. I'm a big fan of eleuthero, but I go back and forth between eleuthero and ashwagandha. Ashwagandha is great for immune and stress balancing. Eleuthero is better for vitality, so I kind of oscillate. So I'd probably say eleuthero for that trip, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. That's great. Now, any brands in particular that you like, or products specifically that you found to be most effective?
Herb Farm makes a really good eleuthero.
Okay.
Herb Farm, I like them. They use the whole herb, and it's very potent.
Yeah. Awesome. That's great tip there. So the last question, if you were in an elevator with Barack Obama or a congressman and they turned to you and said, hey, Dr. Justin, as a healthcare practitioner, what's one lifestyle tip or one strategy that we should have all Americans do? What would that lifestyle tip or health strategy, what would you say to them, and why?
Well, if I was talking to them, one of the things I think I would mention would be just really subbing the grains for greens. That's the big thing. Patients come in, they're like, what am I going to eat? I'm cutting out the majority of what I eat. It's like really simple. Instead of grains, eat greens. And again, we're assuming the proteins and the healthy fats are already there. That's a big assumption, though. I know that. So sub the grains for greens. Simple. That'd be it.
That's awesome. I love that. So, and you also have your own podcast. You have a very active YouTube channel and stuff. You want to kind of plug the links and kind of tell our listeners where they can find you best?
Yeah, beyondwellnessradio.com. Again, you can find us on iTunes. You can subscribe there to our email list. Again, we just interviewed you, which was a great podcast, so all your listeners should be able to hear you in action as well. JustinHealth.com and fixyourthyroid.com. Those are my big pet projects. Fix Your Thyroid's all about thyroid. It's my thyroid connoisseur website, and Justin Helps, my clinic site. Again, I have a thyroid series, an in-depth thyroid series, and female hormone series on each. And again, I have a couple of spots I open up per month to help patients with a one-on-one complimentary consult to kind of get them started to figure out what the next step in their health journey is to get well.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Dr. Justin, thank you so much for being here. You're just a wealth of information. I love how you explain things and use those analogies and so forth. And folks, we'll post the show notes again at highintensityhealth.com/Dr. Justin. So I hope you have a great afternoon and a good weekend.
Thanks a lot, Mike. You too.